All right, so let's get started. All right, so let's get started. So what did we talk about today, or what did the chapter talk about for today? Carter, Shipley, what did the book talk about today for this chapter? Colin, do you want to help him out?
Case studies and case researches.
Okay, case study and case research as a part of a broader concept of qualitative research, right? In class on Monday, we talked about experimental research, right? Which tends to be very positivist, very quantitative, right? The idea is that we can know something absolutely if we can do what? What is the big thing about experimental research? What do I have to be able to do?
You have to experiment.
I have to experiment by separating out two things. I have to have a blank variable. I have to control, right? I have an independent variable and a dependent variable, and I control or remove everything else. So the only thing, as much as I can, is to look at the interaction of the independent variable on the dependent variable. So the idea of experimental research is all about control, eliminating anything else that could confuse, distract, or disrupt what I'm trying to experiment on. Okay? Because of that, experimental testing or experimental research tends to go from, here's the theory, here's what I believe is true, and then I create a hypothesis that when I perform this experiment, this is what's going to happen. So I start with a law in mind, and then I look at the specifics of the case and determine how that does or doesn't fit with the case or the law that I have in mind. We call that kind of thinking or reasoning deductive. I start from a specific law and then I apply that specific law to the information I have at hand. Okay? Now, in case studies or in qualitative research, we kind of flip that around. So we rely on something called, if it's not deductive reasoning, it's called what? Does anybody know? It starts with an I. Inductive reasoning. I look at all the facts and then I try to figure out, what do these facts tell me? Okay? So deductive reasoning, for example, is, I believe that this person is guilty of the crime, so what am I going to do? I'm going to look for evidence that proves that they are guilty. What about inductive reasoning? What would inductive reasoning do?
You look at the evidence until it points to the person?
Until it points us to what theory emerges by looking at the evidence. Okay? Qualitative research focuses on inductive and looking at what's there and then figuring out, what does this tell us? Okay? So in discussing the idea that case study allows for theory development and theory testing, I can see why it's important for creating theories. You have all this information in front of you, and you are trying to find a way it can make sense and tie into each other. Shane, you get a gold star for this one. That is exactly what qualitative or case studies, that's what they do. That's why case studies can create or develop theories, because they're saying, here's what we see, what can we figure out from what we see? Positivist theory can only come from theory. It can't create it. Why not? Okay, because the primary focus of experimental research is I'm testing theories that already exist. Right? I'm trying to prove if something is or is not correct, which presupposes that I have to have some belief about what that is before I can start. I have to start with a theory. Qualitative or case study research suggests I'm going to look at what's there and it's going to tell me. I'm going to create theory every time I look at something because I'm looking at what's there. I can then go and connect that possibly to other theory. Okay? So Colin mentions that in the quality of inferences, now remind me, what do we mean by inference? To infer something. Colin, you want to kind of maybe talk a little bit about that?
When you infer something, you go ahead and you end up, the words are escaping me. To infer something is to guess, to assume what he's saying.
Okay. Now, I'm going to disagree with that just a little bit, and I know that you're struggling with the wording. The problem is that when I infer, it's not necessarily just guessing, where it's all just luck. To infer something is to draw a conclusion based on observation. What's the difference between that and guessing? Anybody? Evidence behind it? I'm basing it on evidence. This isn't just my gut feeling. This is based on knowledge and information that's available at hand. So when we talk about the quality of an inference, what are we really talking about? The quality of the evidence or reasoning that led me to the statement that I make. And so Colin's saying that if we're talking about the quality of inferences, doesn't it make sense that case study research would be better in a group than with an individual? Okay, so let's take a look at that argument. Why might it be better in a group? Shane.
Because you'd have other people that have perspectives on.
Okay, so the idea is the inference could have higher quality if more people are bringing their own perspective in, because it increases the representation of ideas, right? Okay. What could make it more difficult? What could the challenge be? And please, not everybody at once. Go for it, Joseph.
Different ideas or too many.
As soon as you add more people in, then I have to account for every person that gets involved, and that dramatically increases the work. Okay, and we're going to get into this in just a minute, but one of the specific things about qualitative research is that most of the time, the research instrument the thing that actually diagnoses or interprets information is the researcher themselves. Right? I'm not relying on any kind of diagnostic tool other than myself as the researcher. Now, we know that every single person probably carries within them things that are going to shape, alter, or limit their perspective. What do we call that? Starts with a B.
Bias.
Bias. Sorry, I don't mean. I'm getting that loud. I apologize. Sherman's going, dude. I went deaf a couple weeks ago anyway. But bias, that prejudice that can affect how we see things. In qualitative research, there is an entire methodology called bracketing. And bracketing is an activity where the researcher goes through a process of identifying what their likely bias is in the study. What do they already know? What do they already believe? How do they already feel about the subject? And they have to write all that down. And they put that in the research. They just lay it out there in the research. Here's my pre-existing attitudes and beliefs about this subject. Why would I do that? What does that do? If I can acknowledge that I am likely to have bias in this topic, and I tell you ahead of time that it's likely that I'm going to have a problem with this thing, what does that do?
It allows you to go ahead and filter your stuff, because that way, if you get a better source later on, you can use that better source.
Okay, but bear in mind, who is the source I'm talking about? Myself as the reader or as the researcher. But as I'm going through the research, if I've already told you I have problems with A, B, C, and D, I can look to see if that's popping up in how I'm interpreting things, right? It gives me the ability as the researcher to be aware. I better go back and look and see if A, B, or C is showing up in what I'm doing. And when I give that stuff, when I give my findings to somebody else, they can be aware of what?
They can be aware of the bias.
Potential for bias, and so they can weigh my results based on, well, but they already said they don't like Boise State. So if I was to examine the impact of Smurf turf on the ability of football players to perceive and play when they play at Boise State because of the environment, but does the color affect how football players play when they're not accustomed to playing on that ground? It doesn't have an impact. Okay, so if that was my research question, and I already said, I don't like Boise State, what does that suggest? I already have what? Bias against Boise State. And I would, as a matter of that process, I would have to explain why and what does that mean, so that if I come and say, yes, it has an impact, they need to pull it up and take it out, they would be able to say, well, but let's look at how valid his research was, because he already told us he has it out against Boise State. Does that make sense? It helps to control for my bias as a researcher in affecting how I do the study. Okay? If I add more people into that conversation, what do I then have to do? If I have to identify, if I have to bracket myself as a researcher, if I broaden that and add other researchers, what do I have to do for them?
Their bias.
I have to add their bias in. And every time I add in a new set of biases, what does that do to the research?
Creates more credibility.
it can create more credibility, but it also can undermine, because then I have, well, how do these compound or interact, and does that affect the quality of the soup? If I have one person making the soup, they taste it, and if they like it, they serve it, right? But if I have 3 or 4 people tasting the soup, what tends to happen?
They have their own.
Every one of them wants to add their own seasonings. And every one of them is going to have to react to the seasonings that everybody else adds. And it creates a very complex soup. It can turn out well. Emphasis on can, not necessarily likely. It becomes very difficult to have multiple people contributing to the study. It tends to work best if I have one person, because I can identify more clearly how their bias affects how the study gets done. Now, this is true for what type of research are we talking about? Positivist and quantitative, or interpretivist and qualitative? The interpretive and qualitative, right? Because I'm interpreting results. And interpreting is based on that kind of taste, right? That's why we want to limit the number of chefs in the kitchen. Now, if I'm doing quantitative positivist, am I part of the research? Nope. It's this specific thing that I've controlled everything else out of, so I've limited as much to independent, dependent variable. The more people that I get involved in that, the more I can shave away those extra variables. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, this brings us, and this really wasn't covered in the book, but I kind of wanted to explain it because I feel like you need to have this context to understand everything that we're talking about when it comes to case study research. My dissertation was a case study. So everything you guys read about this semester, about in this chapter, I had to do all of these things. I got to jump through all of these hoops. Okay? So what I did was I interviewed 9 different faculty members in 9 different locations throughout the Intermountain West. And so I had 3 sets of questions. Each set of questions was its own interview. So it actually wasn't 9, it was 8, because I ended up doing 24 interviews. 3 separate interviews for each individual. Okay? That meant I had 24 hours of interviews with questions and answers. So once I got all of that transcribed, so it wasn't just a video, but I actually had the words on page in front of me, I then started going through and I marked anything that I thought sounded interesting. That's called coding. Coding doesn't have to do with secrets. Coding is simply identifying language that we find to be interesting. Okay? So I went through and I coded and I found about 1,400 statements across those 24 hours worth of interviews. I found 1,400 statements that I thought were interesting, valuable. So then I went through and I looked at each one and identified what exactly was it about that statement that I thought was interesting. And I attached a phrase to that, and that is the code. It's just a shorthand reference that explains what made this interesting or unique. So I went through and I coded all 1,400 of those statements. Then I took all of those code statements and I looked to put them into larger categories. Okay? What do these things have in common? And once I got those into categories, I looked at the categories and I said, do I see themes or overall concepts? If I look at all these categories together, could I make a couple of statements about what I think these statements suggest? In my case, I came up with 6. themes. Okay, does this make sense? And then basically those 6 themes became the focus of my research. What are these? What do they mean? If this theme is true, what does the literature have to say about that theme? If this theme is true, how do I change my practice as a teacher based upon it? And that's what qualitative research is. Does this make sense to everybody? So it's coding, categorizing, and theming. That's it. Now, this brings us to a great question that Tristan asked, which is, because the information from the case tends to be very specific to what? If I was to observe a classroom of students and their behavior, who am I observing? Those students. Most of the information is going to be specific to that class and those students. If that's the case, is this saying that it's difficult to use the data gathered for anything else but what it was part of in the initial study? Does that make sense? So if I observed this specific class of you as students, can I really apply that to anything else other than this class and you as students? What do you think?
It'd be hard to, but you could.
You could, but the thing is that qualitative research tends to be limited in its generalizability. The goal of qualitative literature isn't to try to say this is what is true for everyone. It is simply trying to come to understand what is happening in the specific event that I'm looking at. So it begs the question, if that's the case, then why do it? If it doesn't apply outside of that classroom, why would we do it? There's 2 possible answers. The first is it's something called intrinsic nature. The nature of the situation itself is unique. There is something about this class that makes it unique from all other classes. And so it's interesting just because nobody else gets to see this. So for example, if we were to go back to, and I apologize that I don't have this date locked in my head, but I want to say it was 2012, 2013, Obama orders SEAL Team 6 to go to Peshawar, is it Pakistan? And what do?
Take down Osama.
They take down Osama bin Laden. What would it have been like to be in that room when it happened? That would be a qualitative study. Does that conversation happen again and again and again? No. It's one time and it's unique, but it would sure as hell be interesting to hear from all of the different people who were in that room at the time, right? That's an intrinsic case study. I want to know everything that happened at that one event. The second is a representative case study. Anybody want to guess what a representative case study is? If intrinsic means unique and one of a kind, what do you want to bet that representative means?
More general.
It's more general. There are elements in this class that even though this class is unique, there are things that could repeat to a degree or apply to a degree in other places. My job is not to tell, as the researcher, I'm not trying to tell you how to apply it. I'm simply providing the information here so that you as the reader can come in and pull out what you think is useful or relevant. Sorry. Does that make sense? So, in answering this question, it all depends on, is there something unique and one of a kind? Or do you see things in this information that could be applied by other people? And that's how you answer the question to that. So the book then mentions the concept of case descriptions and case studies, and says, what's the difference between these two? Case descriptions and case studies. There's one significant difference. A case description, I could also replace it with case examples or case illustrations. Anytime where I say, for example, let's look at the example of blah, blah, blah. And then we talk about how that applies to whatever principle or concept we're talking about in class. That would be a case description. It's an illustration that gives us a point to converse or discuss. Case study is a specific research methodology that has its own rules and procedures for doing. So simply mentioning a situation where something happens, that's a description. If I follow a specific methodology to talk about it, that becomes a case study. The problem is some people use these two words as if they were the same. I am guilty of that. I use the term case study. For example, in my 1257 class, I use that all the time. But we're not doing a case study. You're not going through any specific research process. I'm not asking you to code anything or categorize anything. I'm simply asking you to do what? Yeah, just to describe it. Describing is enough because then we can talk about its significance. But I'm not asking you to do any kind of analysis or procedural process on it. But this thing gets into what Shandon asked, and I think I might have talked on this a little bit. What exactly defines this as science if it can't be quantifiable? Now remind me what quantifiable means.
Proved without a doubt. There's enough evidence supporting it to where there's nothing that could be said otherwise.
I'm going to tell you right now that never happens. No research has ever been able to be proven beyond a doubt without any question. It simply says, to the best of our knowledge, this is what we understand to be true for now. Okay? But the idea of quantifiability means it can be measured or weighed. And qualitative analysis or qualitative research can be quantified. It just uses a different process than quantitative or positivist approach. So for example, when I did my case study research, the very first thing I had to do was identify and bracket my own prejudice, right? Then, at every single stage, I had to explain exactly how did I code? What process did I use? What measures did I use to identify things that stood out? What process did I follow? And was that a process that was accepted by other experts in the field? I had to explain exactly what that process was and how that process connected to other people, so I had to connect myself to the literature. And then at the next step, when I did categorization, I had to explain exactly how I did that so that other people could look and see if my method of thinking and reasoning to arrive at conclusions was coherent. It's the exact same thing as, well, the first thing I did was I zeroed out the scale. Then I poured on the product until I reached exactly 15.03 grams of the product. And then I added that at a temperature of such and such degrees to this other product that weighed exactly 14.633 grams. Then as I observed the reaction of the two, I noticed that the temperature increased, that it started to bubble, eventually boiling and reducing to a liquid that was this much in volume with these characteristics. I'm simply describing exactly what I did and how I did it. I'm creating a breadcrumb trail that people can look and say, well, but why did you do this? Or did you forget this step? I had to explain exactly how I arrived at those situations. So the idea of quantifiability is, in this case, the method that I followed. Case studies and qualitative research. Here's who I interviewed. Here's how I interviewed. Here's what I know about them. Here's what I know about myself. Here's what they had to say. Here's how I led. If they said this, I coded it this way. And I had to do that for every single one of the individuals that I interviewed, all 8. For each interview, I had to explain, here are the questions I asked. Here were some of the things they said. Here's how I coded that. Here's how I then categorized it. Here's how that led me to my theme. You can take or leave my themes. That's fine, but you have to understand, how did I get there? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now, Colin gets back to this idea of inductive research. I feel like if you start off with a set idea rather than a general idea, like going from an entire category to a simple one, can limit the person's choices or ideas about the research topic. Okay, and this is what we were talking about with the idea of deductive reasoning versus inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, I'm going to look at the evidence because I either want to prove that person X is innocent or guilty. What does inductive reasoning try to do? I look at the evidence, and what does the evidence suggest? It suggests person X or person Y is guilty. What's the difference in the two approaches? Well, if I come in thinking person X is innocent, what am I going to do with research or evidence that disagrees with that position? I'm either going to throw it out or ignore it. What about inductive reasoning? What is inductive reasoning going to do? It assumes who's guilty. Everyone or no one. I'm not going to cross anybody off the list until the evidence gives me a reason to do so. I'm not going to automatically assume it was the husband or the butler. Everybody's potentially guilty and everybody is potentially innocent until I have enough evidence to eliminate them from the suspect pool. Once I've gone through all the evidence, I have to go back and look at who's left in the suspect pool, and then I keep going from there. Does that make sense? So quantitative is, here's what I already think, and this is either going to increase my confidence or decrease my confidence in that thing. Qualitative is, here's what I want to know, but I have no idea where they're going to take me. I have no idea what the correct answer is. So I'm going to collect all the evidence, and the evidence itself is going to tell me what's there. It can be very, very frustrating and very scary to do this kind of research because you have no idea what if you're doing it right, you should have no idea what the answer is going to be. Because I don't want to put my thumb on the scale and say, well, here's what I think it's going to be, because that's going to affect the way because you had mentioned this, Christy, in the comments, it's going to change how I hear what people have to say. I'm going to miss certain things because I'm looking for this thing that I already believe exists. I'm going to miss the other 3 things they told me that could point me in a different direction. So Tristan asked the question, so would this be better to do before experimental? Based on what we just talked about, what do you think, Tristan? What's that?
I thought it would be best to formulate the theory.
Mhm.
And proof of the theory.
Yep.
And then another experiment.
Yeah, so for example, in the qualitative study I did, I came up with a theory at the very end. Now what I could do is I could go back and say, okay, let me test that theory. Let me find specific examples and then take these 6 themes and see, do those exist in the situation like I described it? I'm flipping from inductive reasoning to deductive. Now that I've created my theory from qualitative exploratory research, I can now do experimental research. Is it consistent in this situation or in that situation? Okay. Finally, and this is Shannon, this is an absolutely fantastic question. How do you determine if cases are too similar or not similar enough? Is it simply at the discretion of the researcher, something that's generally agreed upon, or are there actual guidelines for it? The answer is that it's really up to the researcher is going to argue this. They are going to provide their best case for why do they think that these cases are similar or dissimilar. But then they leave it up to the reader to make the final decision. Is this close enough to that I can see a transfer of ideas or not? There isn't an absolute yes or no answer because the case study is written and then the individual audience member gets to decide, does this apply to what I've done or not done? And if the answer is yes, they can use it. If the answer is no, then they move on. It doesn't invalidate the study, it just says it's not useful for that particular reader. Yes?
So would that be like an example of the cross-case analysis, taking similar cases and comparing them?
Well, I would have to make the argument as to whether or not that similarity exists. Then when people read it, they can decide if they agree with my argument, and if they agree with my argument, then they would look at the results. But if they look at the argument and they disagree, they move on. But that doesn't mean that the cross-case analysis isn't useful. It just says that it depends on the person reading it. There isn't some inherent natural thing that says this is going to be true and useful to everyone. I've created this piece of knowledge, but you get to decide if you're going to use it or not. It is much less strict. It has its own structure and its own requirements, and they can be very demanding, but it doesn't focus as much on pre-existing structure when you start it. And that can require a lot of flexibility and hope on the part of the researcher that they're going to be able to get where they want to go. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have any questions? All right. So I have a gift for you. I have got something that has come up and I am not going to be here in class on Friday. Therefore, I am absolving you from doing your survey research reading. Have a good weekend. Okay? On Monday, and I want to stress this, it is in your best interest to be here physically on Monday. Okay? I will be broadcasting this class, but I have, by sad experience, realized people don't seem to be getting as much from online activity as they do from face-to-face. We are about to begin our research proposal activity. This is a major part of your grade. Being present so that you can ask questions in the moment is going to set you up for success. Okay? Which is what I desperately desire for all of you. Okay? So remember, no class Friday. Really important that you come to class and you are paying attention on Monday.
No class this Friday, right?
No class Friday.
Okay.
October 30th, you can log on if you want to, but you're not going to get anything from me.
All right.
Okay?
Reading's not required either.
The reading it for Friday is not required because we're not going to have a chance to go over it because we've got to move on. Okay? This research proposal is going to cover the rest of the class. So just like what we did with the case study, that's what's going to happen for the next couple of weeks until the end of the semester, until Thanksgiving. Here's the problem with that. If you are not making significant personal progress on your paper on a daily basis, the next 3 to 4 weeks, I promise, will fill up with projects and assignments and other things from all of your other classes. If it hasn't already started, it will. Procrastination on this assignment will kill your grade. That's why I encourage you to be in class present. That does not in and of itself guarantee that you're going to be making significant progress, but the odds dramatically increase than trying to do this on your own. Okay? All right, that's everything I have, folks. I will see you all on Monday.
Will you be posting the class lecture for today?
Yes, I've just got to get it connected.